Well, we had an interruption, so this is going to be part two of that particular lecture, looking at the expansion of the Puritans over into other areas from Massachusetts. We were talking last time about Thomas Hooker. Thomas Hooker is the one who was pointing out the difficulties with staying in Massachusetts, and so he is going to be the one that's going to lead the people to another place. A little bit of background on him: he was chosen as the pastor of the church at Newton when he arrived in Massachusetts in 1633. In June 1636, just 3 years later, he led his parish to Hartford. Notice he led his parish. The whole church went together. As I told you before, the the Puritans did not just go individually here and there normally. If they came to America, they came as a church congregation. If they moved from where they originally came, they moved together as a church congregation. And so he went to Hartford, 100 miles west, led the colony there until his death in 1647. Now, one of the huge influences that Thomas Hooker had, not only upon Connecticut, but upon the United States, was his authorship of the first written constitution in America, called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. You can see written in 1639. Now, the Mayflower Compact was a written document that gave the impetus toward governing themselves and of consent of the governed, participation in government. But the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut actually give us lay out a constitution that was used to govern. And this had a great influence then upon the establishment of the United States. Basically, he adopted the system that was being used in Massachusetts, with the exception of elimination of the church membership requirement for voting. So he believed that people outside the church should be able to participate in government as well. The people who owned property, who possessed good character, and were religious were the ones who could vote, which made up about a third of the colony. Now, one thing that it's important for us to understand that because there were disagreements between Hooker and the authorities in Massachusetts, didn't mean that they did not get along otherwise. That did not remain a point of contention. John Conn, whom you may remember being referenced earlier, said this concerning Hooker: "He seems to have been regarded the common property of the churches in all the New England colonies," unquote. For example, he was elected moderator of the first New England Synod, gathering of all the churches together in New England. He was effectual in healing the schism between Wilson, Wheelwright, and Cotton at the time of Anne Hutchinson. He was even invited by Cotton and Davenport to attend the Westminster Assembly of Divines in England in 1642. You may recognize that word Westminster. It was out of that assembly that came the Westminster Catechism, which many of you may be familiar. But he refused to go because by that time he had become congregational. He decided that there was no reason to be a part of the Church of England any longer. But he was highly regarded throughout the Puritan settlements. All right, so that's Thomas Hooker. Remember him. Thomas Hooker is the one who planted the colony in Hartford, the first one to leave the Massachusetts colonies to settle in a different area. The next man that leads some Puritan settlers away from Massachusetts is John Davenport. John Davenport desired to establish a church and commonwealth based on a model that seemed more scriptural than any other. He was wanting to get more Bible-based in his ideas of government. So he left Massachusetts to establish a settlement in New Haven in 1638. He did restrict voting to church members, unlike Hooker. And for him, the church and state was intimately knit together. They acted in concert. You can see here is New Haven, where Davenport took his congregation. Eventually, in 1662, as you see in the bottom there, Hartford and New Haven merged together to form the colony of Connecticut. A few years after that, Davenport left New Haven and was called to First Church Boston to serve there as a pastor. And so once again, you see there was no animosity toward him for having led some people to a different place. All right, so that's Connecticut. Remember Hooker and Davenport. Next we move to Rhode Island, and we're going to see Roger Williams is going to be the main character here. Roger Williams arrived in Massachusetts in 1631, and he brought with him a reputation for being a strong and opinionated leader. He soon demonstrated that he was also the purveyor of strange ideas. These ideas soon led to dissension. The main points of his contention between Williams and the Puritans were these. First of all, he said it was a national sin for England to take Indian land without just compensation. He felt that it goes back to England. You know, the English government should have had a policy of paying Indians for whatever land they took. Secondly, he denounced the Puritans for not severing all ties with the Church of England. He felt that they were trying to get away from the persecution that they had been enduring in England, part of which was because of the Church of England. So he was of the opinion that they ought to just sever it all and really become congregational in their outlook. Each church would be their own church without being a part of a denomination, if you will. He also denounced the Puritans for, he also advocated complete separation of church and state. Now, he did not mean by that the same thing that we hear today when people talk about separation of church and state. What he meant was that the church and the state or the government should operate separately. He did not believe that there should not be influence of the church on the state. He just believed that there needs to be a separation of the government of both, that there should not be a mixture together of that. And it's in fact, that is going to be the major issue that's going to provide the impetus for action by the Massachusetts authorities against Roger Williams. So Williams was eventually banished. He viewed the Puritan Commonwealth differently. The Puritan leadership saw it as an integration of religious and civil activity to the glory of God, an example to all others. He felt that the mixing of the government and the church was a mistake. So as a result, the General Court banished Williams in 1635. Now they had, just like with Hutchinson, pled with him to not spread his ideas, to keep quiet, but he refused to do so. After many entreaties, eventually they forced him to leave. It was in winter time, and so many people who think the Puritans were awful people point to that and say how terrible that the Puritans forced him out in the winter. But this was after a long period of attempted efforts to get Williams to stop what he was doing. He had been a missionary to the Indians at one time, although he stopped that because he got the idea that Christ was returning soon and that Christ himself would go to the Indians and speak their language, and so there was not much point in him doing it. But he had made friends with the Narragansett Indians nearby, and they took him in during the winter. Following that, Williams led some of his followers to establish a settlement that they called Providence, saying, the word Providence meaning that God is looking out for them here in what would be called Rhode Island. The colony of Rhode Island instituted complete separation of church and state, prohibiting the government from establishing or supporting one religious group and protecting churches from state interference. Williams' views on religious liberty attracted a variety of religious groups and malcontents to the colony. Anywhere where people had trouble with religious opinions and could not live in a particular colony, they could always come to Rhode Island. Although Williams continued to embrace strange ideas of theology, eventually narrowing his concept of a pure church to eliminating the institutional church altogether. he still was valued by the Puritans in Massachusetts as a scholar and a friend. His ideas of a pure church so narrowed the particular church over which he was pastoring until finally it was just he and his wife. And he wasn't so sure about his wife. But even so, the Puritans continued to use Roger Williams. They used, for example, a pamphlet he had written against the Quakers. They still considered him a valuable person. So that takes us through partway of Rhode Island, and tomorrow we'll pick that up with the story of Anne Hutchinson.